The handcuffs were cold enough that I remember the metal more clearly than I remember my own voice. "Claire Bennett, you're being placed under arrest for felony embezzlement and falsification of corporate records." The security officer's tone was flat, professional, the same tone he probably used for shoplifters and executives alike. Around me, the open floor of Bennett Freight Solutions had gone dead silent. 40 desks, 40 employees who'd worked beside me for 6 years, all of them frozen mid-motion like someone had hit pause on the entire building. My father was standing at the edge of his glass-walled office, arms crossed, watching 2 police officers walk his daughter out in restraints. He didn't move. He didn't say a word in my defense. He just watched, the way you'd watch a delivery truck being towed for illegal parking, mildly inconvenient, nothing more. My brother Marcus stood a few feet behind him, hands in his pockets, and if you didn't know him the way I did, you might have mistaken the look on his face for concern. I knew better. I'd grown up reading that face for 28 years. Underneath the practiced frown, Marcus was doing everything in his power not to smile. "Dad." My voice cracked on the word, which I hated, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't give any of them the satisfaction of watching me break. "Dad, you know I didn't do this." He looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger asking for spare change. "The numbers don't lie, Claire," he said. "I raised you better than this." Before I tell you how a company's 40-year anniversary gala ended with my father on his knees apologizing to me in front of every investor he'd ever courted, let's rewind 3 weeks, to the ordinary Tuesday morning when I first noticed a discrepancy in the ledgers that was never supposed to be found. And if you're the kind of person who believes karma keeps better records than any accountant ever could, go ahead and hit subscribe on Calm Stories Time right now, because this is one of those stories where the universe takes its time, but it never forgets to collect. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and for 6 years I worked as the senior financial controller at Bennett Freight Solutions, the mid-sized logistics company my father built from a single lease truck in 1986 into a business that moved cargo across 11 states. I didn't get the job because I was his daughter. I got it because I graduated top of my class in accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first attempt, and spent 3 years at a competing firm learning how to read a balance sheet the way other people read a novel, cover to cover, looking for the sentence that doesn't belong. My brother Marcus is 2 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the sun our family's solar system orbited around. When we were kids, Marcus broke curfew and came home smelling like beer, and my father called it letting off steam. When I came home 15 minutes late from a study group, I lost my car privileges for a month. When Marcus failed out of his first 2 attempts at business school, my father wrote a check to a private tutoring company and called it an investment in his future. When I earned a full academic scholarship to study accounting, my father asked me, at the dinner table, in front of company, why I hadn't applied anywhere more ambitious. Marcus held the title of Vice President of Operations at Bennett Freight, a role my father created for him the year he turned 26, mostly because Marcus had cycled through 3 unrelated failed business ventures by then and my father needed somewhere respectable to park him. The job came with a company car, a corner office, and almost no actual operational responsibility, since the operations team quietly did the real work while Marcus signed off on reports he barely read. What almost nobody in that building knew, except me, and eventually, a forensic auditor named Daniel Reeves, was that Marcus had a gambling problem that had metastasized well past anything a vice president's salary could cover. Sports books, high-stakes poker games in the back rooms of restaurants that didn't exist on any public directory, an online casino account under a fake name that I would only discover weeks later while building a case I never got the chance to present the way I'd planned. I found out about the debt almost by accident. Every quarter, I ran a routine reconciliation across every departmental account, cross-checking vendor payments against invoices, flagging anything that didn't line up. It was tedious work, the kind of work most people in the building assumed a computer did automatically, the kind of work that made me invisible at every family function because nobody ever wants to hear about journal entries at Thanksgiving dinner. But it was also the kind of work that meant I noticed things. Small things. A vendor account for a trucking parts supplier in Reno that had received 4 payments over 8 months, each one just under the $10,000 threshold that would have triggered an automatic compliance review. I pulled the vendor file. The company was registered to a P.O. box. The phone number connected to a voicemail box that had never been set up. I sat at my desk for a long moment, feeling the particular kind of cold clarity that comes right before you understand something you were never supposed to see, and I quietly closed the file, because 8 years of watching how my family handled inconvenient truths had taught me one lesson above all others. You don't confront a lie in this family until you can prove it beyond any possible argument. Otherwise, they simply decide you're the one who's lying. If you've ever been the responsible one in a family that only had eyes for the golden child, you already know exactly how invisible that kind of competence can feel. Let me know in the comments which sibling role you grew up playing, and if this story is already sounding familiar, this is exactly the moment to subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because what happened next is going to make you furious before it makes you satisfied. I spent the next 10 days building a file the way you'd build a case for a courtroom, not because I was planning to destroy my brother, but because I understood, better than anyone in that family, that accusations without documentation are just noise. I pulled every payment made to the Reno vendor going back 2 years. I cross-referenced the dates against Marcus's expense reports and travel schedule. I found that every single payment had been authorized using Marcus's digital signature, routed through an approval workflow that, as vice president, he had the authority to bypass without a second signer. The total came to just over $218,000. I didn't go to my father immediately, and I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't fear of Marcus. It was fear of being disbelieved. I had watched my father dismiss every concern I'd ever raised about my brother's judgment for as long as I could remember, and I understood that walking into his office with an accusation this large, against his favorite child, without an airtight case, would end with me being the one escorted out of the building for causing trouble. So I kept building. I pulled bank routing information. I found a pattern of ATM withdrawals near a casino 2 states over that lined up almost perfectly with the fake vendor's payment dates. I started keeping copies of everything on an external drive at home, separate from the company servers, because some instinct I couldn't fully name told me to. That instinct turned out to be the only thing that saved me. On a Thursday afternoon, I was called into a meeting with our external compliance officer and 2 members of the board, along with my father. I walked in expecting, at worst, a routine quarterly review. Instead, I was shown a set of financial records I had never created, documents formatted to look exactly like my quarterly reconciliation reports, complete with a digital signature that had somehow been generated using my company credentials. The fake vendor in Reno was there, but the payments had been relabeled, redated, and rerouted through a chain of approvals that ended with my name at the top instead of Marcus's. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me, the particular vertigo of realizing that the truth you spent 10 days carefully assembling has just been used as a weapon against you instead. "Claire," the compliance officer said, not unkindly, "can you explain these authorizations?" "These aren't mine," I said, and even as the words left my mouth I could hear how they sounded, exactly like the kind of denial a guilty person would offer. "I didn't create these. Someone altered. The digital signature traces back to your employee login," my father said, cutting me off, his voice already carrying the particular finality he used when a decision had been made before the conversation even started. "Your login, Claire. Not your assistant's. Not a shared account. Yours." I looked past him, at Marcus, who was standing near the back of the room, arms crossed, wearing an expression of carefully rehearsed distress. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away, and in that single second I understood, with total clarity, exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it. He had found my external drive. He had found my case file. And instead of confessing, he had used my own research as the blueprint to frame me, 3 days before I would have brought it to the board myself. I want to walk you through exactly how Marcus did it, because the mechanics of it still make my stomach turn even now, months later. Marcus had access to the same shared servers I did, since as vice president he technically outranked me in the org chart even though our departments rarely overlapped. Sometime in the 10 days I'd spent quietly building my case, he must have noticed my activity logs pulling old vendor files, or perhaps he'd simply grown suspicious after I asked our IT administrator an offhand question about digital signature audit trails, a question I'd meant to sound casual but that had apparently rattled him enough to go looking. Once he found my file, he didn't destroy it. He improved on it. He took the exact evidence I had gathered against him, the fake vendor, the Reno payments, the pattern of withdrawals, and he restructured it, swapping his own digital fingerprints for mine using an IT contractor he'd quietly paid in cash, a contractor named Trevor Marsh who worked freelance for the company on network security and who, I would later learn, owed Marcus a favor involving a poker debt of his own. Trevor had the technical access to alter signature logs on the back end, something I didn't fully understand until Daniel Reeves explained it to me weeks later in language simple enough for a courtroom. In effect, Marcus had taken my own careful investigation and used it as a stencil, tracing a nearly identical crime and simply changing whose name appeared at the bottom of the page. By the time I was called into that meeting, the story had already been decided. A senior compliance officer had reviewed the fabricated logs the night before and found them convincing, because they were designed by someone who understood exactly how the real system worked from watching me build the real case. My father, given a narrative that confirmed his lifelong low opinion of my ambitions, that beneath the quiet, responsible daughter was someone secretly resentful enough to steal, accepted it without asking a single hard question. I was placed on immediate administrative leave. Within 6 hours, the company's outside counsel had filed a police report, citing the fabricated logs as sufficient probable cause. Within 24 hours, 2 officers were standing in the middle of the office floor, informing me I was under arrest, while my father watched from the doorway of his glass office and my brother stood behind him, failing to hide his relief. I spent that night in a holding cell that smelled like bleach and old coffee, staring at a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped almost like a bird, thinking about every quarter I had spent building spreadsheets nobody thanked me for, every family dinner where my accomplishments had been treated as a footnote to whatever Marcus was doing that month, every ounce of loyalty I had given a family that had just watched me get handcuffed without saying a single word to stop it. I made bail 2 days later using savings I'd built specifically because some part of me had always known, on some level, that I might one day need money nobody else in my family controlled. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Laura Hines, told me on the courthouse steps that the case against me looked, on paper, unfortunately solid, and that unless something changed, I was looking at a plea deal at best and a multi-year sentence at worst. If you've ever had the people who were supposed to protect you use your own hard work against you, you already know there's a particular kind of grief in that betrayal that has nothing to do with money. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to prove your own innocence to people who were supposed to already believe you, and if this story has you gripping your phone a little tighter, go ahead and subscribe to Calm Stories Time now, because Claire's not done fighting, and neither is Karma. The 3 weeks between my arrest and my arraignment were the loneliest of my life. My mother, who had passed away when I was 24, wasn't there to referee the way she sometimes had when we were younger, and without her, my father's household ran entirely on Marcus's version of events. Aunts who had known me since I was in diapers stopped returning my calls. A cousin I'd once been close with posted something vague on social media about how some people never appreciate what a family gives them, and though she never named me directly, I understood exactly who it was aimed at. My father visited me exactly once during those 3 weeks, at my apartment, not out of concern but out of what I can only describe as damage control. He sat stiffly on the edge of my couch, refusing the coffee I offered, and told me that regardless of how the legal situation resolved, I needed to understand that my behavior, he used that word, behavior, as though guilt were already an established fact, had embarrassed the family name at the worst possible time, 3 months before the company's 40th anniversary gala, an event he'd spent over a year planning as the public unveiling of Marcus as his official successor. I built this company from nothing, he said, staring at a point somewhere over my shoulder rather than at my face. I can't have this cloud hanging over the transition. Do you understand what you've done to this family's reputation? I didn't scream at him. I didn't throw my coffee cup, though some small, exhausted part of me wanted to. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to do at every family dinner where the conversation turned into something designed to make me smaller, and I said only one thing. I didn't do this, Dad. And someday you're going to have to sit with the fact that you believed I did before you ever asked me a single real question about it. He left without responding. I didn't hear from him again for 2 weeks. What kept me from unraveling completely during that stretch was Laura, my lawyer, who, despite her initial pessimism about the case, kept circling back to one detail that bothered her professionally. The digital signature logs were technically flawless, almost too flawless, formatted with a level of procedural understanding that, in her words, reads like someone who spent a career inside financial compliance, not someone panicking to cover a crime in a hurry. She suggested, gently, that whoever built the fabricated case against me might have had help from someone with real forensic accounting expertise, and that if she could get an independent auditor to examine the logs at a level of detail the company's own compliance officer hadn't bothered with, we might find a crack in the story. Neither of us knew, at the time, that the insurance company covering Bennett Freight's fidelity bond policy was about to make that decision for us. Before releasing any payout related to the alleged embezzlement, their underwriters required an independent forensic audit, performed by a specialist with no prior relationship to the company. The name they sent over belonged to a man named Daniel Reeves, a forensic accountant with a reputation, in certain circles, for catching things nobody else could see. Daniel Reeves showed up at Bennett Freight on a gray Monday morning carrying a single black case, wearing the kind of unremarkable gray suit that made him easy to overlook in a room, which I would later learn was precisely the point. He had spent 11 years working white-collar fraud cases for a national accounting firm before going independent, specializing in exactly the kind of digital signature forensics that made my case so difficult to unravel from the outside. What nobody at Bennett Freight knew, including my father, was that Daniel had, years earlier, worked a case that had become something of a quiet legend inside forensic accounting circles, a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme at a regional bank, uncovered not by a senior partner or an FBI task force, but by an anonymous junior analyst who had built an airtight case entirely on her own initiative and then insisted on remaining unnamed in the final report, out of concern that publicly exposing the fraud would destroy the career of a mid-level manager's family who had nothing to do with the crime itself. Investigators in that world had nicknamed the analyst the Ledger Ghost, someone who could see through a fabricated set of books like glass, and who never once asked for credit. That analyst had been me, 7 years earlier, during my first job out of college. Daniel didn't know that yet. He simply began his work the way he began every case, methodically, without assumptions, treating every document in the file as a claim to be verified rather than a fact to be accepted. Within his first 2 days at Bennett Freight, reviewing the compliance officer's original findings against me, he noticed something that had escaped everyone else entirely: the digital signature logs. While formatted convincingly, contained a metadata timestamp inconsistency in the authorization chain, a 4-minute gap between when the fabricated approval was logged and when the underlying document had actually last been modified. It was the kind of detail that meant nothing to a compliance officer skimming for a plausible narrative, but it meant everything to a man who had spent a career learning exactly how real financial fraud left its footprints. He requested access to the raw server logs, not just the polished compliance report. He requested interviews, not just paperwork. And on his 3rd day, he requested to speak with me directly, a request my father initially resisted, until Laura pointed out, correctly, that refusing an independent auditor access to the accused party would look considerably worse for the company than allowing it. I met Daniel in a small conference room at my lawyer's office rather than at Bennett Freight, since I was still on leave and technically banned from the building pending trial. He set a small recorder on the table, asked my permission before turning it on, and then spent the first 10 minutes simply listening while I walked him through, in as much technical detail as I could manage, exactly how I had originally discovered the Reno vendor discrepancy and the process I'd used to build my own case before it was stolen and repurposed against me. Halfway through my explanation, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately place. "The methodology you're describing," he said slowly, "the threshold flagging, the cross-referencing against travel schedules, the external drive kept separate from company servers as a safeguard, I've seen this exact approach before. Years ago. A case at Whitfield Bank. I blinked at him. I worked at Whitfield Bank for 2 years before I came here. Something shifted in his posture, subtle but unmistakable, the look of a man connecting two pieces of information he'd been circling for days without realizing they belonged to the same puzzle. "You're the analyst who caught the Moreno fraud," he said. It wasn't a question. "You're the ledger ghost. If you're the kind of person who believes the quiet, careful work you do when nobody's watching always eventually gets seen by the right person, you're going to love where this goes next." That's exactly the kind of story Comstories Time exists to tell, so if you haven't yet, this is the moment to subscribe, because Daniel Reeves is about to turn this entire case upside down. Once Daniel understood who he was actually dealing with, the entire investigation accelerated. He requested full server access going back 18 months, not the curated set of documents the compliance officer had originally reviewed. He cross-referenced Trevor Marsh's contractor login records against the exact timestamps of the fabricated signature changes and found that Trevor had accessed the back-end signature database from a residential IP address on 3 separate evenings, always between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, always shortly after a string of text messages exchanged with Marcus's personal phone number, which Daniel was able to trace through subpoenaed phone records once Laura formally petitioned the court for discovery based on his preliminary findings. He found the casino withdrawal pattern I had already identified weeks earlier, but he took it further than I'd had time to, subpoenaing records from an out-of-state high-stakes poker operation that Marcus had visited using a fake name tied to a burner card, a card funded, ultimately, by the $218,000 that had vanished from the fake Reno vendor account. Marcus, for his part, began to unravel the moment he realized an outside auditor was digging deeper than the original compliance review. He started showing up late to work. He snapped at colleagues over minor things. He cornered Trevor Marsh in the parking garage one evening, an encounter caught partially on the building's exterior security camera, in which Trevor could be seen backing away with his hands raised while Marcus gestured aggressively, though the audio wasn't clear enough to make out specific words. 3 days before the company's 40th anniversary gala, the event my father had spent over a year building toward as the public unveiling of Marcus's promotion to company president, Daniel finished compiling his full forensic report. He brought it first to Laura, as the law required given the ongoing criminal case, and then, at Laura's strong recommendation, he requested a private meeting with my father, hoping to resolve the matter quietly before the anniversary event rather than turning it into a public spectacle. My father refused the meeting. He was, by that point, so deeply invested in the narrative he'd built, the story of the daughter who'd betrayed the family and the son who was stepping up to save it, that he told his own outside counsel he saw no reason to relitigate a closed matter 3 days before the most important night of this company's history. It was, in hindsight, the single decision that guaranteed the collapse would happen exactly where he least wanted it to happen, in front of every investor, board member, and industry partner Bennett Freight Solutions had ever courted, on the one night my father had built specifically to showcase his legacy. The 40th anniversary gala was held in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel, 300 guests in formal wear, a jazz quartet playing near the bar, a massive banner reading 40 years of Bennett Freight Solutions suspended above a stage where my father was scheduled to formally announce Marcus as the company's next president. I hadn't planned to attend. Laura had advised against it, given the ongoing case, but Daniel called me 2 hours before the event and told me, in a voice more urgent than I'd heard from him before, that he intended to present his findings publicly if my father refused to hear them privately, and that as the wrongfully accused party, I had every right to be present when the truth finally came out. I put on the one formal dress I still owned and drove to the hotel with my hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. I arrived just as my father was stepping up to the podium, champagne glass in hand, beginning a speech about legacy and family and the values that had built Bennett Freight from a single leased truck into a company employing 400 people. Marcus stood beside him on the stage, beaming, already wearing the confident posture of a man about to be handed everything he'd never actually earned. Daniel Reeves walked directly to the front of the ballroom, holding a slim folder, and requested the microphone with a calm, unshakable authority that made my father pause mid-sentence rather than refuse him outright in front of 300 guests. "Before this company names its next president," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "I think everyone here deserves to know what an independent forensic audit found regarding the embezzlement case that led to Claire Bennett's arrest 3 weeks ago." The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone senses, at once, that the evening they came to witness is not the evening that's about to happen. Daniel laid it out methodically, the way he'd built his entire career doing, the metadata inconsistency in the fabricated signature logs, the residential IP address linked to a contractor named Trevor Marsh, the text message pattern between Marsh and Marcus Bennett timed to each falsified change, the subpoenaed casino records tracing $218,000 in embezzled funds directly to Marcus's gambling debts under a false identity. He explained, in language simple enough for every stunned guest in that ballroom to understand, that Claire Bennett hadn't committed any crime at all. She had, in fact, discovered the fraud first, quietly, methodically, exactly the way she'd once uncovered a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme early in her career, a case still studied by forensic accountants around the country, a case where she'd been given a nickname she'd never once used publicly, the Ledger Ghost. Her own brother, Daniel said, turning finally toward my father, stole her investigation, altered it to frame her, and let her spend a night in a jail cell so that he could walk onto this stage tonight as your successor. And you let him? Marcus's face had gone the color of ash. He opened his mouth to say something, some denial, but the words never made it out, because in that exact moment, 2 uniformed officers who had been quietly stationed near the ballroom's side entrance, alerted earlier that evening by Laura, working in coordination with the district attorney's office once Daniel's findings became formal evidence, began walking toward the stage. My father turned to look at me, standing near the back of the ballroom in my one-bid dress, and for the first time since the night of my arrest, I watched something in his face crack open completely. Marcus didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, not in a room full of 300 guests and a company built on a name he'd just detonated in front of every person who mattered to it. He was arrested on the stage where he'd expected to be crowned, in front of the banner celebrating 40 years of a legacy he'd nearly destroyed to cover a gambling debt, and let out through the same side entrance he'd once used to slip away from confrontations his whole life. Trevor Marsh was arrested separately 2 days later, and given the volume of evidence Daniel had compiled, both men eventually accepted plea deals rather than face trial, Marcus for felony fraud and falsification of records, Trevor for computer tampering and evidence fabrication as an accessory. My own charges were formally dropped within a week, the district attorney's office issuing a statement acknowledging that I had, in fact, been the original whistleblower whose investigation was stolen and weaponized against her. My father found me in the hotel parking garage that night, still in my formal dress, sitting on the concrete step outside the elevator because I hadn't trusted my legs to carry me any farther than that. He didn't say anything grand. There was no elegant speech, no dramatic collapse to his knees the way it might happen in a movie. He simply sat down heavily on the step beside me, silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it in my entire life. "I watched them put handcuffs on you," he said, and I didn't say a single word to stop it. "I've spent 3 weeks telling myself I was protecting this family's name, and the whole time, the person I should have been protecting was sitting right in front of me, and I couldn't see her. I didn't rush to forgive him. 3 weeks of exile, a night in a holding cell, and a lifetime of being treated as the footnote to my brother's story wasn't something I was willing to smooth over with a single apology on a parking garage step, however sincere it sounded in the moment. "I'm not going to pretend the last 3 weeks didn't happen," I told him. "But I'm done being invisible in this family, Dad. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it starts with you actually seeing what I do, not just noticing me when something goes wrong." He nodded, and for once, he didn't argue. Daniel Reeves reached out to me 2 months later with an offer I hadn't expected, a position at his forensic accounting firm, working alongside the very specialist who'd uncovered the truth that saved my life, doing the kind of investigative work I'd quietly excelled at for years without anyone outside a small circle of fraud examiners ever knowing my name. I took the job. Bennett Freight Solutions restructured its executive leadership under an outside interim president while my father, humbled in a way I don't think he'd ever expected to be, began the slow work of rebuilding a company culture that hadn't just tolerated favoritism but had nearly destroyed an innocent person to protect it. I still don't know if my father and I will ever have the kind of relationship I once wished for as a kid at that dinner table, watching him praise my brother for showing up at all. But I know this much: I stopped waiting for his approval the night I watched him choose silence while they put handcuffs on his own daughter, and there was a strange kind of freedom in finally letting that expectation go. Karma doesn't always move fast, and it doesn't always look the way you picture it. Sometimes it looks like a quiet man in a gray suit, carrying a slim folder into a ballroom, willing to say the one true thing everybody else in the room was too afraid to say out loud. If this story meant something to you, that's exactly the kind of story we tell every week here on Calm Stories Time, so if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever watched karma take its time before finally showing up for someone who deserved it?